Good afternoon. I'm Ben Rubin. Welcome to UK Column. Today, I'm excited to have what I think promises to be an important conversation with Dr. David Miller and Vanessa Beeley. David Miller is an author and an academic, very famously or infamously sacked by Bristol University a few years ago for his anti-Zionist views based on his extensive research into the Zionist movement in the UK. And Vanessa, as UK Column viewers will know, is a regular contributor to UK Column news and through her fantastic articles. Welcome, David and Vanessa.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We've asked David and Vanessa to join us today to get into what I think is probably one of the most important issues of the current moment, here in the UK certainly, but also I think further afield. And one of the things that I've personally been seeing in the maybe more mainstream public discourse around the two primary conflicts that are taking place in the world at the moment, the war in Gaza between Israel and Palestine, and the war in Eastern Europe between Ukraine and Russia, is that there are many people, particularly as they might define themselves sitting on the political left, and this is especially prevalent in our cities and in our university campuses, and in particular with the younger generation, that people and groups are very much pro-Palestine, and on that basis, I think anti-war, anti-genocide, which is a position that I think anyone with any decency would hold, but also at the same time pro-Ukraine and backing Zelensky and Ukraine and ultimately NATO in the war against Russia, what they call Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine. And my view, based on my understanding of the situation, is that those two positions are actually irreconcilable. And I know that there are clear links between Israel and the Zionist movement and Ukraine. And in fact, I've heard it described, Ukraine described previously as northern Israel, essentially. I think that this is something that needs to be explored further. And David has written on this quite a bit previously, produced some fantastic articles, very well-referenced articles. And I'm really looking forward to finding out more about this issue today and hopefully providing a counterpoint, a counter-narrative to that kind of dominant discourse that I've talked about that I've been seeing here in the UK and further afield. So my first question then to you, David, is this something that you recognise, this coincidence between the support for Palestine and the support for Ukraine in these groups that I've described?
Well, I think that's broadly correct. I mean, the epidemic of Ukrainian flags on the high street seems to have died down a little bit over the last couple of years, but there is a strong feeling, I think, on what I would characterize as the liberal left, which is hostile to Russia, and on that basis is favorable to Ukraine, although they might have at the edges some worries about some of the positions taken by Zelensky or about the role of Nazism in the Ukrainian forces, etc., which they don't tend to go into a lot, but there are some worries. But these sort of liberal positions are that, yes, of course, you shouldn't kill Palestinian children. And yes, of course, they would say that they have the same position, which is that you shouldn't kill Ukrainian children, which, of course, is their attempt to draw a parallel between the special military operation in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza, where, of course, there is no such parallel, as anyone who has examined the issue for a moment will conclude. So yes, of course, there is this kind of contradiction in liberal left ideas, but we see this in a lot of issues. That the liberal left position on many issues is quite simply wrong, but on some issues they kind of get it right. They're kind of right on Palestine. I mean, they don't go nearly far enough for me, but that's the problem with liberalism. It's kind of right twice a day, like a stop clock, and on the question of Ukraine is comprehensively wrong, of course. The idea that Putin was provoked in Ukraine is, of course, a sound one. As anyone who's gone back to the records of the pledges given by a slew of different Western leaders, including senior American leaders, including the presidents, to the Russians, that they wouldn't go an inch towards Russian borders. And of course, they then proceeded to allow all of the Eastern European countries, almost all of the Eastern Bloc countries, to join NATO. And that's, of course, what provoked the special military operation in Ukraine, was the a potential accession of Ukraine to the EU and indeed to NATO, but also, of course, the assault on the secessionist people of the Donbass, who, after the coup in Ukraine back in 2004, fought a secessionist war. And essentially what was happening was they were being killed and massacred, and the Russians went in to defend them. And now those provinces have, of course, overwhelmingly voted to join Russia and not to be part of Ukraine anymore. So there's no comparison between the two. There is one comparison, however, and that is that the West is, of course, on the side of Ukraine and joining NATO and the EU, and the West, of course, is also on the side of the genocide in Gaza. So that's where the real equivalence is if you support Ukraine, you're effectively in having the same position as the West, which is supporting the genocide in Gaza, as everyone knows. So liberal positions don't tend to work out very well with those realities.
No, certainly not. The term liberal, I think, might be part of the problem. I always like the phrase "stand for nothing, fall for anything." I think that seems to be operative here.
Yeah, yes, indeed. I mean, look, what's happening in the Ukraine now, of course, is a somewhat complex, isn't it? We've just seen, haven't we, the deal which was apparently made between the Russians and the Trump administration, such that the Russians would scuttle from Syria, letting the government of Bashar al-Assad collapse, in exchange for a settlement in Ukraine. And, I don't want to be rude to Mr. Putin, but how is that settlement going, does he think? It doesn't appear that it's going anywhere fast, that it looks like the Americans have, lied about the extent to which they were willing to go for a settlement in Ukraine. And we're getting really, so far, nothing much in the way of any kind of progress. Although at the same time, we are also seeing Ukrainian lines collapse at a more accelerated rate than has been the case for the last months anyhow. So I think that there's an issue here about what's actually happening in Ukraine and whether we're going to see an end to the conflict in Ukraine. And it's, in a way, it's a parallel with what's happening in Gaza, because, of course, the Americans have promised various things specifically to Hamas and also to the Iranian government, which they then have gone back on. They told Hamas that they would have a ceasefire for a period if they released that American/Israeli prisoner. And they did that. And of course, what then happened was that the Israelis escalated immediately thereafter. So what we're seeing, I think, in this period is an indication of the way in which the Trump administration operates. It says all sorts of nice things, and then it goes back on them. It lies. And this is not a surprise. This is what American governments always do.
Indeed. Vanessa, did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, Arnie, I think David's absolutely right, particularly on the Trump administration. Psychologically, Trump is a businessman. He's also a borderline sociopath. And I think any negotiation with Trump should be viewed in the prism of it being a win-lose negotiation, a win for Trump and a lose for whoever he's negotiating with. This is well known. It's also well known that what the Americans do, whether it's Trump or another, we know that there's very little difference between the so-called duopoly in the US. the fact is that when entering negotiations, they enter dishonestly. So they present a negotiating paradigm, which then is completely changed. I mean, initially they were talking with Iran about enabling up to 3% enrichment of uranium. Now suddenly the red line is any enrichment of uranium, which of course is a red line for the Iranians. And so this is what the US regularly does. But I think also coming back to the point about the liberal view on Palestine and Ukraine, I think what liberals often do is to ignore the historical context, and we're obviously going to get more into that. But the connections historically between particularly Benjamin Netanyahu and the former founders of Zionism, or one particular form of Zionism, Zeev Jabotinsky, or Jabotinsky, however you want to say that, who not only founded what is now known as revisionist Zionism or expansionist Zionism. Netanyahu's father, Benzion Netanyahu, actually worked for him as a private secretary. He edited all of the publications of Jabotinsky's branch of Zionism, which was founded in Odessa, and Odessa was known fondly by the Zionists as the gates of Zion, because it was the hub or the center, the nerve center of the Zionist operations on the continent. And then later was the hub from which the majority of the settlers came from Europe, particularly Eastern Europe and particularly Ukraine, to settle and basically steal Palestinian land. And Jabotinsky was famous for his 1923 article, The Iron Wall, in which he said, there is no justice, no law, and no God in heaven, only a single law which decides and supersedes all, which is settlement. And so we'll get more into this, and I'm sure David can add to that. But I think this connection is something that, as you said, that the so-called left wing in Europe and the UK, even in the US, are woefully ignorant of, and potentially also willfully ignorant of. I think many of these kind of liberal anti-war pacifist organizations, one, deny the right of armed resistance, but two, divide their support along lines of ignorance. In other words, or lines where they deliberately ignore the historical context, which leads them to take a very mistaken position. We had that on Syria. We had many of the pro-Palestinian movements in the UK in particular taking an anti-Syria stand for the majority of the regime change war, because they've been duped by members of the pro-Palestine, let's say, lobby on the side of the Muslim Brotherhood that were instrumental in pushing the regime change narratives from 2011 onwards. So I think it's a very good lesson for people to take a deep breath before taking any kind of support position for anything that is being orchestrated effectively by the West in any way, shape, or form. And Ukraine, Russia's war was definitely orchestrated by the West. And take a deep breath and study the history of that conflict.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think a lot of people essentially just take the easy route with this stuff, and also get very much caught up in the kind of 2-week news cycle, the latest thing, and however that's being presented to them. And they barely look at anything, 2 years, 20 years, certainly not 200 years back, right? So I think that's a big part of this. So look, we've just covered a whole slew of different issues, and we're certainly going to come back to US and Russia and Trump and Putin and Syria a bit later on in the discussion. But Vanessa, thank you for that. You've just introduced a little bit about the history of Zionism and its links into Ukraine. And I wonder, David, if you wanted to add on to that and give us some of the context, both politically, but I think also religiously and theologically as well, because the roots really do run deep here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting thing here, which is where I can talk about the development of Zionism in the Ukraine, but it also, because of the way people react to how one would talk about this, or how I would talk about it, given the historical record, it gives a useful insight, I think, into the way in which sections of I've used the term liberal left, but I'm really talking about now the left, the actual so-called revolutionary socialist left, which has, and it shows in their response to how we'll talk about this. It shows the way in which I think effectively their ideas about the Jews and about Zionism have been effectively influenced and captured by Zionists themselves. And I'll try and explain that as well. So look, what the settlement in Odessa, I use the word settlement advisedly because Odessa was a town founded by Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia. And it was founded by her after, I think in 1796, they had kicked the Muslims out. The Ottoman Empire had been in that area, and they were kicked out. And they founded a new settlement, a settler colony. And amongst those who went there were people of Russian origin, of German origin, and a number of others, but also Jews who were not allowed in the Imperial settlement, and they went to Odessa to found Odessa. And so the Jews who were there, as the others who were there, were settler colonists. They had gone, and the natives had been removed by Russian armies, and they settled there in a settler colony. Now, when I mentioned this before, I think 2 years ago now, I was denounced, yes, of course, by the right, but also by the left, including leading members of the revolutionary left in this country, as being an anti-Semite. Because somehow, if I was saying that Jews were settler colonists in another place, that must mean that I think that Jews have this propensity because of their religion or something, or to settler colonialism. Now, and of course, this is simply ridiculous. Partly it was born out of ignorance. They had no idea that Odessa was a settler colony. They had no idea at all. And so there's a kind of sense in which a kind of Zionist-friendly view permeates the anti-war movement and the anti-racist movement in the UK, which has been the case for a long, long time. Let me take a second out to explain how that happened. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, many servicemen came back from the war to find a nascent fascist movement on the streets in the UK. And many of these, including many Jewish ex-servicemen and many members of the Communist Party, formed a group called the 43 Group, which was dedicated to fascism on the streets. And the BBC did a documentary about the 43 Group and the success of the city group some years ago. Now, this was an organization which was fighting fascism on the streets, but which also had a relationship to Zionism, such that by 1948, 30 or 40 of its members went to Palestine to take part in the Nakba. And indeed, the leadership of the organization signed up en bloc to affiliate to the Irgun, the revisionist Zionist terrorist organization coming out of the whole Jabotinsky experience. And since then, of course, there have been Zionist influences in the anti-racist movement all the way through. There have been two major influences. One is Zionist anti-racist groups, i.e. not anti-racist groups, such as the Community Security Trust or Tel Mama or Hope Not Hate, for example. But on the other hand, also largely Trotskyist, sometimes communist influenced anti-racist groups, which have been soft on Zionism. They've had a relationship with Zionism, which is that we have to have a common front with the Zionists. Thus, we don't focus on the main form of racism in the country, which in this period has been anti-Irish racism, anti-Black racism, and now Islamophobia. Instead, we focus on fascism and Nazism, which, of course, are the least threatening ideological currents for people of colour in this country. So that, I think, is part of the problem, is that there's been a compromise with Zionism in all of the far left and all of the anti-racist, almost all of the far left, all of the anti-racist movement, which has meant that it's very difficult for them to actually deal with some of the issues we now face in relation to the genocide. Now, back to the Ukraine. So yes, the Zionist movement was effectively created in Odessa, as Vanessa says, was referred to as the Gates of Zion by the Zionist movement themselves. And there was a guy called Stephen Pinsker who set up an organization called the Lovers of Zion, prior to the existence of the Zionist movement in the 80s. The Zionist movement, of course, was created in the 1890s. So there's a strong history of Zionism there. Of course, Jabotinsky was from there. And a significant number of very senior Israeli military and indeed prime ministers and presidents have come from Ukraine. So it's a kind of crucible for the creation of the settler colony in Palestine. And that relationship, of course, has never really fully dissipated. And maybe we'll go on to talk more about that. But that's the history of this, is that Zionism comes from Ukraine. So it's not surprising then that many of the Zionists who are in Ukraine have a sort of a strong view on Ukrainian nationalism. And the thing I would say about that, to explain that, is that from the very beginning of Ukrainian nationalism, there was a strong parallel between Ukrainian nationalism and Zionism, partly because, of course, they're very similar ideologies, but also practically they had a relationship. So famously, Jabotinsky made a deal with the Ukrainian proto-fascist leader Simon Petliura, who, of course, was assassinated on the streets of Paris by a Jewish Russian anarchist, if I'm not mistaken, because of his involvement in pogroms against the Jews. Jabotinsky at one point wrote in his diary that this would be his epitaph, that he was the Jew who had made a deal with effectively the fascist Petliura. There's a famous Soviet cartoon from that period, from the 1920s, with Petliura in his grave and Jabotinsky at the side of the grave, weeping tears over the murder of his compatriot. So there's historically been a strong relationship between Zionism and Ukrainian nationalism.
The issue in terms of Zionism and its relationship with the left, and the fact that the left, they're kind of in a bit of a bind at the moment, right? Because actually, I think the issue is that a lot of, well, first of all, you've kind of pointed out that a lot of these proto-communist ideas were heavily influenced by Zionist thinkers in the first place, and actually the kind of the end point of a lot of the kind of radical left activists and even people who are fairly mainstream in this, like Jeremy Corbyn, for example, they're actually interested in this idea of global governance, right? They actually think that global governance and top-down centralized control is a good thing. It's just that they want it to come from their side of the political spectrum versus the other side of the political spectrum. So that puts them in quite an interesting position in terms of, what they can and can't say and what they allow themselves to see and to condemn out there in what's happening in the world.
Well, I mean, I think that Jeremy, of course, is not really an anti-Zionist. Never really has been. There are people on the left. I mean, a party like the Socialist Workers' Party is a party which has always historically been anti-Zionist. I mean, it's famously its leading ideologue, a guy called Tony Cliff, who anglicized his name from Egil Gluckstein, and of course had experience of the settler colony in Palestine because he was there. Him and his not then wife, Cheney Rosenberg, she lived on a kibbutz, a Hashoma Hatzair kibbutz, and Hashoma Hatzair was the most radical left wing of the Zionist organizations, and their experience of that kibbutz and the fact that it was Jews only, anti-Arab, it was endemically racist, that's what turned them off Zionism. And so ever since then, the SWP has been an anti-Zionist organization, at least formally, but now it seems to have a real difficulty in actually, not just the SWP, but the whole of the left actually, in using the Z word. You can't say Zionism because that will somehow overemphasize the responsibility of the Zionists for the genocide and underemphasize the responsibility of US imperialism. That will let US imperialism and indeed the British role in the genocide off the hook. And that's a profoundly misguided and mistaken approach to take, in my opinion. The people who supported Hitler in the Second World War, yes, there were British companies and American companies, and in fact, American publicists and PR operatives. They weren't the ones who were responsible for what the Nazis did. It was the Nazis. And similarly, in this case, it's the Zionists who are doing the killing, the Zionists who recruit the people the thousands of young men and women who have gone from the UK and France and Germany and Brazil to commit the genocide, they're the ones who did this. Of course, they are supported by the Americans, who give them 70% of the weapons and the political cover, by the Germans, who give 30% of the weapons, and of course by the British, who do the overflights, the intelligence overflights for the IDF, more overflights, in fact, than the IDF do themselves. But nevertheless, we should be clear: the people who are training their guns on the heads of 3-year-old toddlers are Zionists, and it's the Zionist movement which has led this strategy, and the Zionist movement which is carrying out the strategy. And therefore, we need to, I think, focus on Zionism, what it is, how it operates, and how it can be defeated, rather than have a kind of what I might impolitely call a lily-livered approach, which says we don't actually discuss Zionism.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to come back to the Jabotinsky, because I think he's really someone that where people can make that very clear connection between Zionism and Nazism in Ukraine, because, as David rightly said, he collaborated with Simon Petlura, who actually massacred tens of thousands of Jews from 1919 onwards in the pogroms in that particular area, right? Jabotinsky basically agreed to provide Jewish militia to support Petlura on the basis that they would be collaborating against a potential threat from communism, i.e. from then the Soviet Union. And Jabotinsky went on to form the Betar youth movement, which, as David has pointed out in one of his articles, were dressed very reminiscently of kind of fascist youth groups in brown uniform. He was a supporter of Mussolini, but most importantly, he believed in this revisionist Zionism, which was followed, as I said, by Netanyahu's father, Ben-Zion, and now, of course, by Benjamin Netanyahu himself, who's the longest serving prime minister in the occupied territories. And this was that colonization could only be imposed by force. There was no peaceful resolution with Palestinians. And of course, that is exactly what we're seeing to be Benjamin Netanyahu's policy against Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, but also the fact that Netanyahu has incorporated into his administration some of the far more right-wing members of Israeli political movements, including, Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. Smotrich has just gone on record saying, forget about any kind of peaceful resolution, starve the Palestinians, we need to eradicate them completely. Moshe Feiglin has just gone on saying our problem isn't with Hamas, it's with all Palestinians, particularly babies. We should be murdering the babies. And so, when you look at this, it's an unbroken arc from Jabotinsky to Netanyahu now. And that's what people are failing to recognize. They're failing to make this direct connection to Jabotinsky's policies as a Zionist cooperating with Nazis in Ukraine and Benjamin Netanyahu's policies now to exterminate Palestinians, both in the occupied territories and in Gaza, to ensure the final solution, which is Zionist settlement of those territories.
This is what I think people really struggle with, right? Because you've just talked about a Jewish militia collaborating with Nazis in Ukraine who had actually committed atrocities against Jews in order to achieve their own political agenda. I think a lot of people struggle with the level of cynicism and just the pure naked lust for power required to do these, to carry out these kinds of actions.
I know that it is, as you describe. I mean, let's remember that the militias which Jabotinsky formed were intended to be militias to protect the Jewish people. They were Jewish nationalist militias. The agreement that Vanessa referred to was an agreement that the Ukrainian nationalists would govern their people, the Ukrainians, and that the Jewish nationalists would govern their people, the Jews, with their own militias. And the only time where they would have to have anything to do with each other and have to fight together was against the Russians. That was the deal. That is the kind of philosophy they have. Is a very, very similar philosophy. So yes, of course, they don't want to be themselves to be attacked, but they believed they had a deal with the proto-fascists of Petliura and the rest, and that they have of course had a very similar idea about what it was, what the state or the idea of the Jewish people was, and how similar that was to the Ukrainian nationalism. I mean, in a way, I think how they started to think about Jewish nationalism learned and took a lot from the Ukrainian nationalists. It's very, very similar when you look back at it. They have this very similar ideas about the Volk, about the people, about their sovereignty over other people, which is very similar to Zionism today. Now, Vanessa also referred to the uniforms. Now, the Beitar was, of course, the kind of youth wing of the revisionist movement, and if you do a Google image search for Beitar, and you look for the black and white photographs, you find all sorts of interesting looking uniforms on these young men, including there's a famous one from 1923 in Poland, I think, which has the young Menachem Begin in his military uniform. Now, if you look at Beitar's website today, they still exist today, and I'll talk about that. They have 7 principles. Have had this from the beginning. One of the principles is Magen, which means protection, and it requires individual members, all members of their organization, to engage in military and paramilitary training, and to be willing personally to fight come the appropriate moments. From the beginning, Beitar has been a militia, which is a military organization, and today it remains the same. They have, of course, been involved in the US recently in compiling lists of Jews to provide to the Zionists, who will thus afterwards be stopped from going to this entity and amenable to all sorts of other punishments that the Zionists might put together for them. And just the other day, they threatened to kill Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur. This is a development within Zionism, which is about the resurgence of effectively Jewish militias outside of in the US, in the UK, and there are various iterations of these organizations. And what we're seeing is the return, effectively, of Jewish terrorists to the streets in the West, which hasn't been the case since around the 1940s, when, of course, the Irgun and the Lehi, the Stern Gang, were engaged in terrorist activities in the UK, up and down the UK, including, of course, the famous Irgun cell in Glasgow, which people are often not aware of.
We talked a bit about the history, and the links between the Zionist movement in Ukraine, but through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. But this obviously goes right up to the present day. I mean, to what extent is this embedded into organisations like the IDF, for example?
Well, I mean, this is the other thing. I mean, you were remarking about this. People finding it difficult to get their head around Nazis and the Zionists cooperating in the 19th and 20s and 30s. Well, it's happening today as well. I mean, let's remember that there are Nazi militias inside the Ukrainian armed forces. In fact, increasingly over the period since the SMO was launched, having effectively the whip hand inside Ukrainian military forces. Now, amongst those who have joined up to the Ukrainian military are a number of Ukrainian Jews, including members of the Chabad sect, which is a genocidal Hasidic Jewish sect, which is organized all around the world. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But that the role of the Zionists in the Nazi movements inside Ukraine is instructive. One of the founders, the 2 co-founders of the battalion, the famous Nazi group inside the Ukrainian armed forces, was an ex-IDF officer. So those kinds of links are baked in from the beginning of the Nazi movement in Ukraine, and it's no surprise, therefore, that organizations like Chabad and indeed other Orthodox Jews in Ukraine have joined up with both non-Nazi forces in Ukraine and indeed with Nazi forces. Now, Chabad is an organization which comes from a place called Lyubavitchy, which I think is now in present-day Belarus. And the headquarters of the organization is in Brooklyn, famously revealed just the other last year, I think it was, as having secret tunnels built under it by some kind of rebel faction within the organization. Now, Chabad is a genocidal organization. It's an organization which believes that non-Jews have animal souls. It's an organization which is, according to the Shin Bet, the Zionist intelligence agency, involved in most of the price tag revenge attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank around the settlement of Yitzhar. And of course, it's an organization which has outreach emissaries all around the world. There's 5,000 branches in different parts of the world, 1,300 in America, 150 in Britain, 150 in Canada, and organizations all the way across the Ukraine, a dense network in the Ukraine, and indeed, of course, in Russia, which we might come on to later. Now, in Ukraine, the Chabad have been close to one of the key oligarchs in Ukraine, a guy called Igor Kolomoisky, who, of course, owned the television station where Zelensky got his start and then funded Zelensky in his campaign to become prime minister or president. He then fell out with Zelensky. But amongst the other things which he was funding were the IDAR, Nazi IDAR battalion, and indeed the Azov battalion, as well as funding, being one of the key funders of what's called the biggest Jewish community center in the world in Dnipropetrovsk, which is a Chabad center, there's plenty of little videos online. You can go and look at that architecturally questionable building. let me put it that way. So look, the connections between extreme ultra-Zionist genocidal organizations and the Nazis in Ukraine are not something that have been dreamt up by people who are conspiracy theorists or on the left or whatever. These are actual relationships. Now, Kolomoisky, of course, was involved also in a number of corruption charges in terms of effectively theft of public assets, but also the way in which that was then, the money from that was then laundered through European institutions and into the US. So there was a network in the US, in Florida, and in New York State of charities which were laundering the money, and these charities were all run again by Chabad. So there's a really interesting sort of underworld here to this, which does suggest that the relationships between Zionism and Nazism in Ukraine and the Ukrainian government are not something which are just marginal.
Certainly not. Vanessa, would you like to weigh in on that?
Reports also of former or even current IOF military fighting in Ukraine, because I think Haaretz put out an article bemoaning the fact that they weren't being recognized as fallen when I think between up to 16 IDF fighters were killed in Ukraine. But even during the 2014 coup, organized, of course, by largely Victoria Nuland, with the US administration backing when she made the famous phone call during which she told the EU to bugger off. I'm saying it far more politely than she did. And basically, there were known to be IOF militia fighting at that time among those that were leading the coup and also massacring the civilians, of course, in the Maidan and in Odessa itself, ironically enough. But not only that, Israel has been supplying weapons, including the Tavor rifles, to the Ukrainian militia and to the Idor and Azov battalions. And of course, not forgetting Zelensky's rather bizarre comment that Ukraine will become big Israel, which I think was fairly early on in the conflict. And the fact that Olena Zelensky, I'm not sure actually whether Zelensky joined himself in the end, but Olena Zelensky visited Israel, as did, I think it's Ilya Smolyenko, who was a member of intelligence within the Azov battalion, and who visited after the what was the big factory in God, it's just Azov something. Anyway, he visited Israel, was a guest. Thank you. That's it. And he visited Israel and was sort of given red carpet treatment by Netanyahu and his administration. And so, as you said, the connections between Ukraine and Israel have continued pretty far into the present day. And I believe actually that one of Netanyahu's election promises was a victory for Ukraine, along with supporting freedom fighters in Iran, of course.
So the Chabad thing, I think, is absolutely crucial to understand as well, right? Because we've talked about the political background to this, but I think that the theological background is as, if not more important. You describe Chabad as a genocidal organization. Some of their texts are absolutely astonishing. We'll provide some links so people can go and have a look at this stuff for themselves. And the Chabad rabbi, I'm going to say this incorrectly, but it's Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Is the way I'm going to pronounce it. Please correct me if I'm not doing that right, doing that justice. But he had an extraordinarily close relationship with Netanyahu. Now, many people actually view Schneerson, certainly within the Chabad movement, as actually being the Jewish Messiah. I don't think that he actually adopted that mantle himself, and I do seem to remember him it being reported that he told Netanyahu that that Netanyahu himself would see the arrival of the Messiah in his lifetime. So there's some kind of prophetic stuff happening here as well that I don't think people really properly understand. And he was, I think, as you mentioned a moment ago, born in what is now today Ukraine, right? I mean, so the depth of this is, it's not just political. It runs a lot deeper than that.
Well, look, I think people don't understand. You say the theology. Now, the theology is quite important. I mean, I'm a sort of materialist. I believe that material things shape the world, but of course, ideas about how the world is and how the world might be also help to shape the material world. So, I think we should understand that Chabad is a Hasidic sect, yes. And it's a kind of outreach organization. So it has these 5,000 odd offices around the world. But there are hundreds of other, well, not hundreds, but there are lots of other Hasidic sects, most of which are inward looking and which have very similar views to Chabad, theologically and about the state of Israel. There are very few. I mean, let me just try and explain this. So from the beginning, these sects, almost all of them come from Eastern Europe, from Lithuania, from Poland, from Hungary, from Belarus, from Ukraine, and indeed from what's now Russia. And as the boys from Natura Carta, the well-known anti-Zionist Hasidic group, are always saying, but in 1947, the chief rabbis were agreed there should not be a Jewish state, and that it was the responsibility not of humans to create a Jewish state, but only of the divine. And so they were all, at that stage, anti-Zionist, right? Now, people find it very difficult to get their heads around this. These were anti-Zionist in the sense that they didn't believe that that the Zionist movement had the right or the ability even to create a Jewish state. And if they did create a Jewish state, it was outside the realms of religion and something to be condemned. Now, of course, what happened after the creation of the State of Israel was that almost all of them made their peace with Zionism. Some of them, of course, remain of the view that their young shouldn't serve in the IDF, while at the same time being practically supportive of the Zionist state, including, of course, serving in the cabinet, Netanyahu's current cabinet. They have people in there whose young people don't join the IDF. Incredible. So these are anti-Zionist people who are Jewish supremacists. right? That's the distinction I would make. Not all Jewish supremacists are Zionists. All Zionists are Jewish supremacists, but there are anti-Zionist Jewish supremacists who, of course, in almost all cases, are happy to collaborate with the State of Israel. There's one large sect called the Satmar, which remains anti-Zionist in a more straightforward way, but they're not in favor of Palestinian liberation. So there's a whole range of these Hasidic groups, almost all from Eastern Europe, almost all of which are Jewish supremacist and indeed genocidal. The Chabad are interesting because they are the only outreach grouping. They have these offices all around the world. The others don't do that. They have their own religious organizations and their own yeshivas and etc. But Chabad are there to convert and convince, not convert non-Jews to some extent, but mainly to bring Jews, either observing or non-observing Jews, further towards the ultra-Orthodox position. And that seems to be the thing which they are most successful at. There's evidence from the Zionists, from Zionist surveys on campus in the US, that the people who are most are taken along by and taken in by Chabad are not people who are already ultra-Orthodox, but people who are in the reform or the progressive or the liberal wing of Judaism, all of which, of course, are Zionist synagogue movements. So that's their role. Their role is to radicalize and to bring people to the position of supporting the genocide in the way which Vanessa has been outlining, which the so-called extremists in Netanyahu's government are doing. Now, of course, the Schneerson, the Rebbe who died in 1994, no, I don't think he believed he was the Messiah. All of the Chabad doesn't believe that he's the Messiah. There's a faction who believe that he's the Messiah, and a faction who believe that he's not. But they believe in the building of the temple, the destruction of Al-Aqsa, in the same way as many of the other factions who are engaged in that kind of activity do as well. So they have a sort of role in, I suppose, radicalizing the more secularist Zionist movement. And you can see in the history that we've had over the last 90 or 100 years that there's been a trajectory from the dominance of a secular leftist Zionism towards a secular rightist Zionism, with the dominance of revisionist Zionism in Israeli politics since 1977, towards a more religious, a bigger role for religious Zionists and the ultra-Orthodox. And that's what we're seeing now, I think.
I'd like to introduce you, and certainly our viewers, you're probably familiar with this, David and Vanessa, right? And people might have clocked I've got a Jewish surname and a Jewish first name as well, actually. I'm a quarter Jewish, and I was raised as an atheist, but I've never been in a synagogue. I don't speak Hebrew, and I'm just a bit of a random mixture, to be honest with you. But there is a phrase that I hear quite a bit when I get invited to Jewish events and I speak to Jewish people, as I do on a regular basis, that 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And that really seems to be coming through in what you've just described to us there, David, in terms of the situation that we have in front of us. The role of Chabad, as you just described, to radicalise the other Jewish organisations in the reform, progressive, and the liberal areas of Judaism is very interesting, and also, I think, if we might just jump back to the US now, I'm particularly interested in the influence that they're exerting over the current sitting US president, because we talked about Chabad's headquarters in New York, and Trump visited there. I can't actually, off the top of my head, remember if it was pre or post-election last year, but there was a number of videos circulating online of him visiting the headquarters, or visiting and praying at the grave of Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And there are even suggestions, not least from people in Trump's inner circle, that he is in fact the first Jewish president of the United States. I mean, to what extent do you think that could be true?
Look, the relationship between Chabad and the Trump camp is reasonably well known. I mean, Trump himself, through one of the nations, has directly funded Chabad. Of course, he's made a point of visiting them and going to Schneerson's grave and hanging out with them. He's had them in to visit him. But of course, let's remember that the key link between Trump and Chabad is his son-in-law, Kushner. And he and Trump's daughter, to whom he's married, of course, they attend a Chabad shul in DC when they're there. And Kushner has given huge sums of money to Chabad in the US, I think perhaps elsewhere as well. So there's a connection there that it's not just that the Chabad are trying to influence the president, but the president's son-in-law is actually funding Chabad. And so that's kind of part of the intrigue here. And let's remember that Kushner's role is not just to push the interests of the official Zionist movement or the ultra-Orthodox guys like Chabad, but also to effectively grease the wheels of the normalization process. And that's why he's had this massive involvement with the Saudis, and indeed to some extent with the UAE, and the use of the sovereign wealth, the Saudi sovereign wealth fund, the massive kickbacks and bribes that are been going to the Trump family, and no doubt in future years we'll find out that they're much more extensive than we are currently aware of. So that's all part of this mix here, that there's a direct question of corruption. But as to whether Donald Trump himself is Jew or is converted, I don't know. I don't pretend to have the information on that, but it's not impossible, is it?
Stranger things have certainly happened. Vanessa, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think it's very important to understand the importance of the Zionist influence through Jared Kushner. I mean, David mentioned this normalization program, which began under the first Trump administration, termed the Abraham Accords. And of course, that basically brought in, I think it was Morocco, Sudan, and UAE as the initial adherents to that accord. But of course, what we're seeing now is Trump putting pressure on the Al-Qaeda self-elected president of Syria, Jolani, to lift the sanctions in order for him to agree to normalize relations with Israel under those Abraham Accords. So those Abrahamic Accords were an incredibly important step, which began back in 1997 with the CIA scripting of the clean break doctrine, which was commissioned by then politician Benjamin Netanyahu, which actually, again, was an extension of Jabotinsky's expansionist strategy to partition all of the neighboring countries to Israel, to both weaken them and give Israel an opportunity to have greater influence in the partitions that would be created. And of course, that's exactly what we're now seeing in Syria, is the coming to fruition of Netanyahu's vision, which originated with Jabotinsky in Ukraine, and the partitioning, not only the extermination of Palestinians and the final supremacy of Zionism over Palestinian territory, but also this partitioning and normalization of relations with all neighboring countries, the destruction of resistance to Israel, and the weakening of every single nation that may pose a threat to Israel in the future. And this began in Ukraine. I think this is what is very important for people to keep relating to. David goes into fantastic depth. I tend to simplify things a little bit more for people in particular who are struggling with this kind of, as you said, two Jews, but you have three opinions of, etc. Because it becomes so complex when you get into the different factions, the competing factions, even within Zionism itself, within the Knesset, and so on. Right. I mean, in Ukraine, there was even the creation of kind of, a blending of Marxism and Zionism, right? So there were different factions, even in Ukraine, you had the Jabotinsky, you had the Love of Zion, which was Leon Pinsker, you had Bev Borachov, who created the synthesis between Marxism and Zionism, which then became the Israeli Labour Party, and Ahad Ha'am, who created the Society B'nai Moshe, which was a form of cultural Zionism. So in all of these factions, you have these subsections, let's say, that may on some subjects or on some strategies have common ground, and in others not. But I think in the end, if we look at direction of travel, we're heading in the direction of travel that Jabotinsky foresaw and that Netanyahu's father certainly supported, and Netanyahu has picked up and run with. And I think, that for me is becoming even more clear with what's happening in the region, not only in Palestine.
Yes, I used the term cynicism earlier, but I also think maybe pragmatism in pursuit of a shared objective is what we're looking at with a lot of this stuff. The reference to communism and Zionism, I think, is really interesting. I saw a quote, I'm going to forget the name, maybe one of you can help me out with it, but the guy that ran the gulags for Stalin quoted as saying, some people call it communism, I call it Judaism, right? So these things are very closely and intrinsically linked with each other, right? This is fascinating, a fascinating discussion. I want to think about, we talked a lot about the historical context, the deep connections between these two countries, these different ideological systems. How is this being enabled and enforced in the media and the political system? Let's, if we could, focus on the UK, but also let's just think more broadly across the US. We've talked about these influence networks, but how are we actually seeing this coming to light in the media around? Let's talk about some names, even the BBC, the Guardian, maybe some of these other commentators in the British system today.
Well, look, these are, I think, complex matters to say, but the way in which these influence networks operate, I think, is much more sophisticated and more deeply embedded than perhaps we have understood. So the way in which people tend to talk about these things is that they talk about the Israel lobby. And of course, there have been some famous books on that issue. The first of which, of course, which broke the whole issue open was John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt's book, The Israel Lobby in US Foreign Policy, from 2005. And then, of course, more recently, we've had Ilan Pappy's book on the Zionist lobby, history of the Zionist lobby in the US and the UK. But look, the Israel lobby is only a small fraction of what the Zionist movement does. And I think the other elements of what it does, which I'll talk about in a minute, are the ones which are really important. So the Israel lobby, of course, is the organizations that we all know about, which is there to influence US, UK, and other European countries, and indeed other countries in general, to influence their foreign policy and indeed aspects of their domestic policy. So in the US, everybody knows that there's AIPAC, there's the Anti-Defamation League, there's the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and a number of other think tanks, lobby groups, etc. And that's the Israel lobby. Okay, now they are important and they do exert power and do exert influence. But there's another way in which the Zionist movement operates, which is that the Zionist movement is a broader thing than the Israel lobby. The Zionist movement is there to ensure that Zionist ideas are spread and made powerful around the world. And they state this openly in their founding manifesto, which was created in 1951 at the World Zionist Congress, the first one they held after they created the so-called State of Israel. And in that Congress, they said, right, we've got what we wanted. They had a program before called the Baal program, the Basel program, based on the Congress where they decided that in Switzerland. And we've got what we wanted. We've got a Jewish state. What will we do now? Will we just demobilize the Zionist movement? And they said, no, we'll not do that. And they had a vote on this, and there were no votes against. There were some people who abstained, but there were no votes against, and they voted. I think it's 450 38 votes to 0, I forget the exact votes, to continue with the Zionist movement. And amongst the things they said that it would do is strengthen the influence of Zionism in the community, meaning the Jewish community, wherever it's organized in the US, the UK, and elsewhere. And that's what they do. And that has two elements to it. First of all, they want to recruit and train the young people in the ideology of Zionism so that they can go on to become Zionists later in life. Sometimes that will mean, going to become colonists in occupied Palestine, join the IDF, etc. But on other occasions, what it means is joining Zionist organizations in the UK or the US, etc. But a further element of this, of course, is infiltrating the societies in which they operate, such that when the moment comes, when the tap on the shoulder comes, I like to say the tap on the shoulder comes, but of course, in many cases, the tap on the shoulder isn't needed. When the moment comes to do the right thing for the Zionist movement, when you're high up in the BBC or the Financial Times or in a financial corporation or in the civil service or in the police or wherever it is, when the moment comes, they want you to take the right decision in favor of the Zionist movement. And you have to have an understanding of that in order to understand the way in which the institutions of this society and many other societies in the West especially have been penetrated and infiltrated by the Zionist movement. Take the example of the media. You raised the issue of the media. Now, people have been going on about the BBC for the last few months, especially since Owen Jones wrote this article in December or January, where he revealed that Rafi Berg, who's in charge of the BBC's website, was effectively operating a kind of a mechanism whereby he had to authorize or approve almost all BBC coverage of Palestine. Now, he is a fanatical Zionist. Now, of course, this is an important element of control by Zionism of the BBC, because they've got a person inside. The other element, of course, is the massive propaganda streams that come from Tel Aviv and indeed from the British government as well in supporting the Zionists. But I think the other thing you've got to understand is that it's not just external pressure which causes the BBC, and it's not just the fact of one person inside the BBC which causes the BBC to be so pro-Zionist. It's also that they have people high up in the hierarchy, and in fact in the most senior committees of the BBC who are themselves Zionists. So the most senior committee in the BBC has, I think, 5 people on it. The CEO of BBC News, a guy called Robbie Gibb is on it, a guy called Nicholas Sirota, who's the external representative, a couple of other people who I forget now. But they always have, of the 5 people on the committee, they always have at least 2 who are convinced rabid Zionists. Robbie Gibb is a perfect example. This is the guy who runs the Jewish Chronicle, took over the Jewish Chronicle when it was failing because of so many libel defeats, and it's now become even more extreme in its Zionism in the last 2 years as a result of him taking over the organization. So if you want to understand why Zionism gets so much favorable coverage in the media, yes, it's to do with external pressures and PR and propaganda and all the usual things, Hasbara as they call it in Israel, but it's also to do with the fact that there are Zionists inside all of these news organizations, quite often in prime positions. For example, in Sky News, it's the case in the Financial Times, it's the case in the Guardian, it's the case in the Mail, and many other media outlets as well. So it's external and internal influences.
And a lot of this is about, I think, embedding confusion into the public discourse, because the organizations we talked about, the pretty much dominant accepted narrative, I would say across the whole of mainstream media, is pro-Ukraine, anti-Putin. It's Putin's war. It's a war of aggression. All of these terms that we hear on a constant basis, right? So they've really embedded that, and they allow some lively debate between both sides of the argument as it relates to Israel and Palestine. But it's this Ukraine, this adamant insistence that Ukraine are the good guys and Putin's the bad guy, while allowing some lively debate over here, that I think is one of the main essentially divide and rule tactics that they have for sowing discord amongst the population, right? And actually, we talked about the media. One of the most striking things I've seen over the past few days, just popped up in my timeline on LinkedIn, I think it was one of the chief executive of one of the biggest charities in the UK and internationally, based in the UK, international charity, who attended the pro-Palestine march in London over the weekend, was sharing a lot of the images from the march and talking about what an important moment it was. And then I actually clicked on to have a look at her own profile page, and the header image is her speaking on stage at a pro-Ukraine event in Trafalgar Square, it looked like. I can't remember exactly the location. And that, to me, was just a perfect example of how this thing has just been really deeply, deeply embedded into the discourse. And it's really astonishing how they've managed to do it.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, there are people on the left who have become even better than they were before on the question of Palestine. But still, some of those people have a blind spot about that they can't quite get to the idea that Russia might not be what's the idea of Russia, which is encouraged in all the kind of NATO propaganda fantasies. So that's a kind of interesting thing, is that people can't sort of divorce themselves from that element of the propaganda. They can perfectly well deconstruct Israeli and Zionist propaganda, the British government's ridiculous defences of Israel. They can deconstruct David Lamb, the intelligence flights over Gaza, but they can't quite bring themselves to deconstruct the views which were given about Russia, and that's kind of interesting in itself. And of course, it reminds one of the famous Bob Dylan song about "I've learned to hate the Russians all through my whole life. If another war comes, it's them we must fight." And that, of course, is very, very deep in the psyche. Actually, it's deeper than we thought. So that's an interesting thing to see, and also indicates the need for us to redouble our efforts at deconstructing anti-Russian propaganda. It's been flooding our media for many years now through the alleged assassination campaigns, which Vladimir Putin is operating against dissidents, the alleged poisoning of the Skripals. Remember that ridiculous fiasco, and then of course the Integrity Initiative, all those documents which were leaked, showing that there was a military intelligence project dedicated to countering Russian propaganda, which was actually mainly focusing on attacking Jeremy Corbyn. And so all of that has been actually quite successful in its pulling of the levers of public consciousness in a way which the British government's attempt to defend Israel has not.
Absolutely. I think there's certainly a lot of the old Cold War stuff still embedded into kind of Gen X and above, right? That's certainly the case. I think the other thing that's really important, now that we're talking a little bit about Russia and Putin, is to understand that you actually don't have to pick a side in these conflicts, and it's not always going to necessarily be the case that there's a good guy and a bad guy fighting. It might be that there are two bad guys fighting. And we talked a bit about Chabad's relationship with Trump, but they also have quite a lot of sway in Russia, and particularly over Putin, it would seem.
I don't know too much about that. I mean, there is a rabbi who is called Putin's rabbi, who is a Chabad rabbi, but that's because, well, I don't want to underestimate the potential significance of it. I haven't done enough research on this, but certainly it's the case that all through Russia and indeed the Ukraine, that the apparatus of Jewish communal representation, so the organizations which in Western Europe and the UK are run by the official Zionist movement, in the Ukraine and in Russia, those organizations are run by Chabad. And so that's kind of an interesting contrast. Of course, we see what happened. Well, maybe we should say a word about Syria. So what happened in Syria, of course, there were Russian military lookout posts on the border with the Golan Heights. There was, of course, the Russian naval base and the Russian air base in Syria as part of the agreement to help the government of Assad. And that, of course, the Russians were, to some extent, trying to divert IDF bombers from bombing Syrian targets. But of course, we should also remember that the Russians deliberately and openly coordinated with the Israelis to allow them to bomb Damascus. Now, in retrospect, that's an indication of the weakness of the support of Russia for Syria, and it's an indication also, I think, of the way in which the kind of relationship that they have with Chabad and with Israel is worth looking into. For example, there's an organization called the Jewish Agency, which is one of the four pillars of the Zionist movement. All four of these organizations are based in the same building in Jerusalem in King George Street, known as the National Institutions. And the Jewish Agency's function, one of the four pillars, as I say, is to arrange for people to become settler colonists in Palestine. The function of the other organizations is, of course, to provide to steal the land so that they can settle there, and thirdly, to raise the money to pay for all of this. Now, the Jewish Agency was about to be closed down by Putin, by Russia, I think in 2021. And there was a series of court cases which came up, and then they were delayed, and they were delayed, and they were delayed. And the Jewish Agency has not been shut down as an agent of a foreign state which is engaged in hostile activity, which it plainly is. So there's an indication, I think, in that relationship of the kind of questionable position of Russia in relation to the Zionist entity. And that, of course, is how you expect, or where you would expect, Chabad to have some kind of influence as well.
Just layer upon layer of complexity here. Let's just finish up. Unfortunately, we've lost Vanessa, because I would have loved her to chime in on that on Syria, of course. I mean, it's certainly her area of expertise, but unfortunately, it looks like the connection's been lost. Just to finish up, though, you mentioned earlier on the reticence of some of the radical left to talk about Zionism because they believe that it lets the British and US empires off the hook for their role in the things that are happening in the world around us today. To what extent do you see the British and US empires and Zionism as being fundamentally intertwined with each other? I mean, is that not essentially just the same thing, just one thing, isn't it?
So I come at this from having done lots and lots of research, and as I've done the research, some of the things that I've found start to make me question previously apparently established nostrums or theories. So I think that yes, of course, there is a very close relationship between the US, the UK, and Israel. The US is, of course, the primary sponsor of the genocide. It supplies the weapons and it provides political cover. And as I've said, the UK provides intelligence overflights. And of course, we have the Elbit arms firms in the UK, which Palestine Action are doing a tremendous job of smashing up over the last couple of years. But look, the other thing about Zionism is that it's inherently colonial, yes, inherently genocidal, yes, inherently racist, yes, but it's inherently expansionist and eliminationist. So it has to expand. It has to find more and more places for their people to settle. And that doesn't just mean the beachfront apartments in Gaza. It doesn't just mean the West Bank. It also means, of course, invading and expanding their territory into what they've always said from right back to Herzl is a greater Israel. Vanessa mentioned the Jabotinsky's thoughts on settlement, which of course are in the same vein. Now, of course, that's what they're trying to do here. They got pushed back out of most of Lebanon, but they still have extra bits of Lebanon they didn't have at the beginning of last year. They have a huge swathe of the south of Syria now. What they want to do is they want to push back into Egypt, take the whole of Jordan, take most of Iraq, take all of Lebanon, all of Syria, up to even including a little part of Turkey, the south of Turkey. That's what they plan to do. And that's called Greater Israel. Now, in addition to that, of course, what they want is, Vanessa was talking about normalization. They want to normalize relations with the whole of West Asia and North Africa, which means that they want to be able to operate these countries effectively as client states. Now that, as a plan, is an imperialist plan. It's not an imperialist plan which is the same as the interests of US imperialism. And this is where I think that, yes, of course, they're entwined, but there are overlapping ways in which they operate and where they have shared interests, and there are other ways where they have divergent interests. And that, I think, is becoming increasingly apparent, and it will become increasingly apparent as the US has to decide what to do about its relationship with Israel. I think they will have to decide whether they're going to cut Israel loose, and Israel will want at that stage, whether it collapses or not, to go on to create this Greater Israel project. I mean, it's an imperialist power in itself, and it's an emerging imperialist power. So I would say that, yes, of course, they're entwined, but all of their interests do not coincide.
Another complex web, it would seem. Okay, look, that's been a fantastic and fascinating and enlightening conversation, David. Thank you so much for taking the time. Also to Vanessa, who unfortunately has dropped off the call. Thank you very much, David.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Good stuff. So I've been Ben Rubin. You've been watching UK Column. Thank you for watching.